crisis. From the poorest villages of Africa and Asia to the richest neighbourhoods of the US and Europe and everywhere else in between, the rising costs are hitting home. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon says world food production needs to be increased by 50% by the year 2030 to meet demand. We'll be discussing the causes and the solutions. But first, from the summit in Rome, Mark Seddon reports.
A crisis on a global scale. From the Americas to Asia, soaring food costs have sparked unrest. Staples like wheat and rice are becoming more expensive by the day. Many people are hungry and angry. This is the enormous task that world leaders face as they meet in Rome. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon underlined the imperative to act, and act now.
Today's problem will only grow larger tomorrow unless we act now today. I call on you to take bold and urgent steps to address the root causes of this global food crisis.
Global leaders find themselves protected by a wall of security, as what was once originally billed as a summit on world food prices rapidly becomes a crisis meeting. But campaigners want more than sticking plaster aid, they want long-term solutions. And these long-term solutions include substantial investment in the seemingly forgotten smallholders and farmers of the developing world.
There is a need for inputs for smallholders, fertilisers, good agricultural extension, support for irrigation, rural roads. There is so much that can be done to increase productivity and to get them fair prices in the markets, because that's the big problem with smallholders.
And now, apparently singing from the same hymn sheet and speaking to Aljazeera for the first time, is the head of the World Bank.
If we can create a green revolution in Africa, what our research has shown is that income benefits in the agriculture sector have 3 times the gain in overcoming poverty than other parts of other sectors. And you can understand why.
This, however, can only be part of any solution, as poorer countries struggle with high energy costs, extreme weather conditions, and increasing populations. Mark Seddon, Al Jazeera, Rome.
So let's try to make sense of some of the causes. First, there is less food readily available, meaning that the prices have shot up. There are a number of reasons why, and they've all coincided to put food prices at a 30-year high. There's the impact of globalization. Fewer countries are producing their own foods because of competition and are therefore increasingly reliant on imports. Add to that the effects of climate change, increasing droughts and so on. A drought, for instance, in Australia that wrecked the wheat crops have meant that the world's main wheat producer couldn't supply many countries in Africa. Then factor in rising oil prices and we find ourselves where we are now. Well, let's narrow it down and look at the effects on one country. Indonesia's population is rising, but on the island of Bali, the amount of land being used to grow rice is declining. Rice paddies are being replaced by golf courses and hotels as the island feeds the demand from tourism. Well, that might be good for the economy, but it means that rice production has fallen, having a direct impact on supply of the region's staple food and driving up prices. The low profit from farming means that younger generations are less willing to continue the jobs of their parents. Well, José Bové is a French farmer and a political activist. His ultimate goal is to promote alternative farming methods, and he doesn't hold up much hope that change can be brought about in Rome. He blames globalization and says countries that can should provide their own food security. This is his view in his own words.
I believe that in Rome nothing is going to happen, because I don't believe that the governments and the big international institution can change anything. All their policies since years have been going on in the same way, opening the market for food coming from the big companies and destroying all the local agriculture. Well, in my view, food sovereignty is crucial. It's the only way to be sure that all the people in the world can eat correctly. That means that each country should be able to feed its own population. And in this moment, WTO, the World Bank and IMF are imposing to the countries the opening of their borders for importing food. This is going against most of the farmers in all the countries, and mostly in the developing countries. We have to be able to protect these farmers. We have to be able to give them land to work. We have to protect their own agriculture and help the countries to build real strong agricultural policies. It's incredible to believe that all these farmers are going to be pushed out from their land to go in the big cities. This is not an issue for humanity, and the only way to fight against hunger, to fight against climate change, is to keep the people living where they are on the countryside. So we have to change completely the way which is going on. And I believe that the farmers, the small farmers, the indigenous people, and the fisher folk should be able to have a new policy. That's why we believe in food sovereignty.
Thoughts of the French farmer and political activist José Bové. Well, joining me now as an expert on world financial markets, Max Keiser, beg your pardon, is in Paris. Thank you for joining us. We heard José Bové there saying that each country should be able to feed itself. Is that the answer to the global food crisis?
The problem has to do with subsidies, but the subsidies take two interesting forms. There are the farming subsidies that we know of in the U.S. and Western Europe that are distorting markets and making it hard for farmers in Africa, for example, to sustain themselves growing food. But the bigger subsidy and the root of this problem, it goes back to last summer. When prices started moving up around the world for food, it had a direct link to last summer, where you began to see the credit crunch and the meltdown in the financial markets, which led the U.S. to flood the market with more money to bail out banks. And all of these commodities and energy are priced in dollars. So when you flood the globe with dollars, you're forcing the price of food up. And these subsidies and dollar pegs, I would like to add to the audience in Qatar, your own country has a peg to the dollar. And this has a pernicious effect on energy prices and food prices. The governments around the world, if they...
But why is that suddenly now? I mean, you know, the food, the pricing and a peg to the dollar has been around for decades, and yet we've had these kind of conditions coming together now. So presumably it's not just that, the issue.
Why now? That's because for 25 years there was a bull market in the bond market, and it was the price of credit was going down for 20 to 25 years. Starting last summer, the price of credit started to go up. And that's the defining moment in this crisis and the banking crisis. They are linked. And these governments are flooding, especially the U.S. government, which is the world's reserve currency. Mideast countries, Qatar in particular, keep their peg to the dollar. It has a negative impact on their local economies. Inflation is raging in Qatar because of the dollar peg, I say, to Qatar.
Okay.
To consider that.
Well, but what could you think could be done in the short term to solve the kind of the problem that the UN is laying out of millions of people possibly going hungry, and that they say there's a need of a lot more money being pumped into it? How do you solve that particular issue?
Simply adding money actually exacerbates the problem by increasing the inflation. What needs to happen is that these commodities, energy and food, need to be traded in other currencies other than the dollar. This would restore some pricing equilibrium around the world. It would give purchasing power to these local economies. And unfortunately, it means that the dollar would take the brunt of this recalibration of the global currency grid. And the UN has shown that they're not going to take on the U.S. banking establishment. They don't have any teeth to take on the U.S. banking establishment in this very critical issue. So we end up with, from the UN, are these Band-Aid solutions, a quick fix, pump more money into the situation, which of course has an inflationary impact. It's actually making the situation worse.
And so how do you, I mean, what about agricultural policy? Does that have anything to do with it? I mean, we talked at the beginning of this about subsidies, and in the US, the subsidies are continuing to farmers there. Europe is very reluctant normally to address agricultural policy. Should those kind of subsidies be got rid of, or do you think that they're actually helping?
Sure, subsidies need to be looked at. The U.S. subsidizes their local corn farmers, and this drives the price of corn down to levels where people around the world can't compete. The U.S. just gave their farmers another $300 billion in subsidies last week. They're giving money away to U.S. farmers. This has a deleterious impact on the ability for global farmers to compete. But this is still a subset, and also the ethanol question is still a subset of this larger problem, this larger issue, which is recalibrating the global currency grid in ways that give developing countries some purchasing power, some ability to price their commodities in their local countries. That means taking on the U.S. banking establishment, which means countries in the Mideast, including Saudi Arabia, taking on the petrodollars and the entrenched monopolists in the U.S. and the UN too. But they're not going to take on the U.S. powers that be. I'm sorry,
okay.
They don't have the teeth for it. They don't have the stomach for it.
All right. On that note, must leave it there.
It's
Thank you very much indeed.
They simply.
Thank you very much indeed, Max Keiser, and for running out of time there.